Dear students, good morning to you all. I welcome you again to this second lecture today. This is on T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent today. After the lecture yesterday on Aristotle's Poetics. As you know, this essay or article or research paper, T.S. Eliot's The Tradition and the Individual Talent, it is prescribed for you in 3.2 paper, Critical Theory Part 1st, second section. As you know, T.S. Eliot happens to be a very great modernist poet, a very influential 20th century critic. He was also a great playwright. Here, you need to understand Mr. Eliot, his life and also his literary output, particularly his poems, The Waste Land, and also his plays, including The Murder in the Cathedral, and more so in the present context. All of you need to understand what Eliot happens to be, how Eliot happens to be a great critic today, his contribution to literary criticism. First, I throw a little light about his autobiography, means his biography details. T.S. Eliot was born as a Boston Brahmin. You should know, he was born in Boston. He was born in a Boston Brahmin family, means a very elite family. American elites were called Brahmins, and he was born in a Boston Brahmin family with roots in New England and also in England, means Britain. Means his ancestors migrated to America from a village called East Coker in South England centuries ago. The family of Eliots was rooted in St. Louis, Missouri state. His father, Henry Ware Eliot, was a businessman, while his mother, Charlotte Eliot, was a poet. Eliot was the last of 6 surviving children. The young Eliot had physical problems and he read a lot. He had a lot of interest in reading, and he attended Smith Academy, where he studied very important classical languages, Latin, Greek, French and German. He began to write poems and short stories while doing graduation at Harvard University. Mr. Eliot had MA in English degree in 1910. He read the French symbolist poets, and he became a friend of a great American poet, Conrad Aiken. Eliot had a lot of ambition to study the kind of interest which Plato, Aristotle, such a great people had. So he moved to Paris and he registered for an admission, maybe for a course or diploma in some subject in Sorbonne University, and there his teacher was Henry Bergson, the psychologist. Then he moved to Harvard back and he studied very interestingly Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. Look at, he studied Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. Then he wanted to do a summer program in a university called Marburg in Germany, but because of the First World War, he relocated to Merton College, Oxford. I did a course at Oxford in 2001 and I visited Merton College once. And he was not so much happy about Oxford and its great philosophical and scholarly traditions. You know what he said as a modernist? This statement speaks of his attitude about modernism. He said, Oxford is pretty, but I don't like to be dead. So Eliot moved to London. So in London, he stayed in different places and he became a friend of so many English writers. And he befriended a very important man, an expatriate American by the name of Ezra Pound, himself a great master craftsman. Mr. Pound encouraged Eliot's study of things, and Eliot left Oxford and taught English literature at Birkbeck College, University of London, and he completed his PhD on F.H. Bradley at Harvard in 1916. A little about his private life. He married a Cambridge governess by the name Viviana Haywood in 1915. The Eliots were not happy, however, because she was always ill and admitted to Insanity Hospital. So they separated in 1933, and his wife died in 1947 in a mental hospital. There is a play called Tom and Veo that depicts the Eliot's life. Mr. Eliot's poem, why I am telling all this with respect to his first marriage is because he wrote later the great poem called The Waste Land, published in 1922, which speaks about the kind of unhappy family life in the West. Very important. Mr. Eliot wanted to survive, and he did teaching assignments and even a bank clerkship. He worked in a bank called George Lloyd. George Lloyd was a governor in Bombay, and if you go to Karnataka College, Arts College, there is his name, George Lloyd. So Lloyd's Bank was there. He worked there as a clerk, and later he became a teacher at Highgate School, where one of the prestigious students was a future poet John Bedgeman. He met a great modernist novelist, Mr. James Joyce, in Paris in 1920, and he became a friend with a great modernist artist, Wyndham Lewis. Wyndham Lewis did a painting of Mr. Eliot, and that is a very important portrait. Eliot joined as director of a famous publishing house called Faber and Faber in 1925, and he encouraged by publishing, he encouraged so many modernist poets, particularly W. H. Adam, Stephen Spender, and Ted Hughes. Then one religious solace or compensation comes in his life, that he got converted from Unitarianism, a branch of Puritanism, Protestantism, which was very popular in America, and now in England, in London, he got converted from Unitarianism to Anglicanism and got British citizenship in 1927. He became an Englishman. See, the attachment is very important here. He proclaimed that it is a very famous statement in modernist English poetry. He was a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. He was in the mainstream. Later he said he combined a Catholic heritage and a Puritan temperament. Eliot said, I see the path of progress of modern man in his occupation, with his own self, with his inner being. Look at this statement. What Eliot is talking about is individual talent. You don't simply follow a tradition. You have cultivate your own genius. So I see the path of progress for modern man in his occupation, with his own self, with his inner being. So it talks about individual self, individual talent. This conversion, as his biographer Peter Ackroyd felt, gave Eliot some resting place, because his ancestors had migrated from East Quaker village in South England to America centuries ago, and now he got back. It's a kind of return to the native. It gave him solace, and he has written a poem called East Quaker. It made him an Englishman. Eliot had an assignment of a famous assignment. This is a famous assignment called Charles Eliot Norton Professorship at Harvard in 1932-33. He had an affair with Emily Hale. His companion Mary Trevelyan of London University wanted to marry him. He was a very charming personality. She has left a memoir. Eliot lived at Chelsea, famous suburb in London town. He married later Esme Valerie Fletcher in 1957. He worked as the editor of the Wesleyan University Press, and he died in 1965. He died in 1965, remember. And his wife Valerie Eliot died in 2012 recently. His ashes were buried in his ancestors' village, East Quaker. The church wall has a quote from his poem, In my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning. Eliot received the Nobel Prize for Literature and also Order of Merit from the Government of England. T.S. Eliot's reputation as a poet is based on a few poems, like Aden, like Yeats, like even William Carlos Williams, or even his great master, Mr. Pound. Mr. Eliot didn't write so many books of poems, only a few poems, few books of poems. He had that regret. But Eliot has written poems even about children, for children, as I see some of them in CBCS textbooks. His first book was Prufrock and Other Observations, 1917. It was followed by The Waste Land in 1922. Mr. Eliot said, "My poetry has obviously more in common with my distinguished contemporaries in America than with anything written in my generation in England." The point is that Mr. Eliot was an American, like Pound, like Henry James. So his modernism is American modernism. It has nothing to do with the modernism in European countries, particularly in Germany, Italy, or France and Spain. It is common only with Anglo-American modernism. Besides Prufrock poems and The Waste Land, Eliot's noted poems are The Hollow Men, Ash Wednesday, Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, Four Quatrains, important poems, and some of them throw light about the eternal qualities of Sanskrit literature in the Vedas. Eliot liked to change his form, so he switched over to drama. He was a critic and admirer of the Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. He felt every poet has some public utility. He said he was feeling towards a new form and style. So this switching over to drama, particularly Elizabethan drama, horse drama, gave him a kind of strength and inspiration. His early dramatic scenes appeared in Sweeney Agonis. He was asked by the authorities of Canterbury Church Cathedral to write a play about the great martyr saint Thomas A. Becket of the 11th century, and immediately he wrote a play called The Murder in the Cathedral in 1935, which was performed as part of the carnival in the 1935 Canterbury Cultural Festival. And his other plays were The Cocktail Party, The Confidential Clerk, and The Elder Statesman, and The Family Reunion, and many of these plays have got awards. The second part of this lecture focuses on literary criticism. The third part of this essay or lecture focuses on his particular essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, published in 1920. T.S. Eliot contributed to the literary criticism, influencing the school of new criticism. You know, T.S. Eliot lived in the first half of the 20th century very actively, and new criticism came to existence in the 1930s and 40s at Yale School with fugitive poets in American South, and he guided them indirectly, influenced them directly. Critic William Emerson felt that Eliot is a great influence as a critic after Samuel Taylor Coleridge of the Romantic School in England. In his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot said, art shouldn't be understood in a vacuum. Man shouldn't be understood or valued in a vacuum. Likewise, art shouldn't be understood in a vacuum, but in the context of previous pieces of art. Only when we compare and contrast a great poem with the poetry of the previous age, past age, great age, even abroad, then only we will correctly judge the value of that great poem. The poet or artist must be judged, he tells, by the standards of the past. Eliot's concept, very important concept in this regard, is described as objective correlativity. Objective correlative. Objective correlative means understanding a work of art in comparison and contrast with other great works of art in the genre. And this he elaborated in his famous essay, Hamlet and His Problems, which posits a connection among the words of the text and events and state of mind and experiences. This notion concedes that the poem means not what he says but suggests. This is another side product of his critical meditation. You read great poetry which is almost abstract, and at the end of the reading you come to the conclusion that you cannot understand the poem at all. No, you need not understand the poem, Mr. Eliot tells. Well, because poems do not give great meanings, messages. You only understand poem by their suggestions. Poem suggests certain things, that is the end of the understanding. So, but suggests that there can be a non-subjective judgment based on different readers, different but perhaps corollary interpretations of work. The new critics took a cue from Eliot in regard to his classical ideals and his religious thought, his attention to the theory and drama of the 17th century, his deprecation of the romantics, his proposition that good poems constitute not a turning loose of emotion but an escape from emotion. He felt that real poetry is a very difficult thing. The point is that poetry you understand only it's because of its suggestions. There won't be hard summary. And another thing is that it influenced new criticism and new critics, Yale school critics of the American South of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, namely Cleanne Brooks, Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, R.P. Blackmore, many others. These new critics also poets, some of them novelists. They invented a method, devised a method called new criticism, which was used for teaching English language in all American high schools and PUC colleges for nearly 50 years. A great, remarkable achievement in American teaching methodology. Because of Eliot, there was a revival of metaphysical poetry. So, the credit of inventing, reinventing, rediscovering Mr. Donne and other metaphysical poets goes to Mr. T.S. Eliot. He displayed how this body of poetry, embodied psychological and sensual experience, plus wit and uniqueness. You read Donne's poems, such as Canonization or others, you come across psychological and sensual experience. In Kannada, there has been a great Bandaya poet by the name Chandrasekhar Patil. You might have heard his name. He is otherwise called Champa. He would always say, you must write your poetry when you have very rich and raw, immediate experience. That was the essence of metaphysical poetry in England. It had wit and uniqueness. This study produced Eliot's definition of unified sensibility. You should know that Coleridge and Wordsworth, as a great romantic poets and critics, spoke of the organic theory of poetry. The organic theory of poetry means that if you separate one part of the poem, you lose the meaning. Means you cannot separate the language from subject matter, nor can you separate the figures of speech used there. No. It all comes as a whole, unified whole. That is the reference to unified sensibility by Mr. T.S. Eliot. In other words, he describes it as metaphysicality. Eliot argued that poet must write programmatic criticism. The poet should advance his own interest, not advance the historical interest. In Eliot's criticism, according to modernist poetry, jargon, etc., what you say is important, not what other historical poets said is important. Your genius is important. The title of this essay is Tradition and the Individual Talent. The individual talent is very important, and this individual talent is to be nurtured and appreciated only in the context of the tradition. That is how you justify the title of this essay. Well, then the poet should advance his own interest, not advance the historical scholarship. His essays, he has written so many essays, remember, such as Poetry and Drama, Hamlet and its Problems, The possibility of poetic drama focuses on the aesthetics of drama. Otherwise, Eliot has written nearly about 100 critical books, and some important of them are to be mentioned here as below. Tradition and the Individual Talent. It was published in 1920 in the form of a booklet. The Sacred Wood, 1920. The Sacred Wood, this collection is very important because it has several important essays by Mr. Eliot. Selected Essays, 1917 to 1932. It was, however, published in 1932. After Strange Gods appeared in 1934. This is also like the Sacred Wood. The book After Strange Gods is a very remarkable book. And very interestingly, like Mr. Arnold before him, he published a book on culture called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture in 1948. The Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. And the last important essay, according to me, is book of essays is The Frontiers of Criticism, like the frontiers of knowledge. Very catchy phrase, isn't it? And let us understand Mr. Eliot as a modernist poet before we throw a little light on his formalism. As a modernist poet, Eliot exercised a strong influence on Anglo-American culture from the 1920s to up to the end of the Second World War, roughly to be taken as 1950s. His experiment in diction, style and versification, means subject matter, forms of poetry and also style and technique are very remarkable, very influential, very new. And what is so important, dear students, Mr. Eliot's harsh criticism, modernist criticism, very phenomenally innovative criticism shattered the old orthodoxies and erected new traditions in English literature. Because of Mr. Eliot, so many older poets, even it affected W. Yeats, if not Hardy and Hopkins. Eliot's modernist criticism, gave a death knell to the creativity of the late Victorian poets in England. For example, Georgian writers, they stopped writing. They all were worried. They were all admiring the great talents of Mr. T.S. Eliot. Well, then we talk of Eliot as a modernist poet. This modernism, I must tell you in brief, this modernism is a great cultural upheaval in the first part of the 20th century. After the rise of Marxism by Karl Marx and Engels, after the rise of psychoanalytical criticism by Mr. Sigmund Freud and others, many art and cultural movements appeared in Europe, for example. For example, you have Expressionism, Impressionism, Dadaism, Cubism, Surrealism, these things. And these art movements, art means not necessarily in the poetry, art means in all fine arts, 5 arts, fine arts means 5 arts. For example, in the field of poetry, in the field of painting, music, sculpture, and also in cinema, new medium called cinema was also about to come. There was theatre, the last thing, there was theatre. So, it appeared on all these fine arts, modernism. The characteristic features of modernism are that it reacted against the past. It shattered the old fashioned things to the dustbin. It affected in literature, as far as literature is concerned, it affected 2 genres. One is poetry, the other is fiction. A great woman writer by the name Virginia Woolf said in 1910, see, our life, our world has changed somewhere in December 2010, she said. Still the World War I was ahead, 4 years ahead. But she said in 1910, our life has changed in December 2010. But the real break came only in 1922 and there appeared 3 important books in literature. The first was T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland Poem. The second was James Joyce's book called Ulysses. The third was Virginia Woolf's own novel, The Jacob's Room. These three remarkable books appeared in 1922. That is said to be the mark of high literary modernism. We are talking about modernism, literary modernism. Thus, modernism came, and in two areas in literature, particularly in poetry and in fiction. When it comes to poetry, great writers, some of them from America as expatriates. It was Mr. Ezra Pound who devised a kind of imagery called imagism, later Fauvism. T.S. Eliot, he has to his credit such a great modernist concepts like objective correlative. Related to this, there is another called impersonality theory of art. We use another word called defamiliarization, very important. His poems you take, for example, the Prufrock poems or other poems like Ash and Wednesday, or this particular landmark poem, that is The Waste Land. It created sensation not only in Europe but also in America. There are three American poets with him. One is H.D. Hilda Doolittle, another is Wallace Stevens, one more is William Carlos Williams. Very notable modernist American poets, and two of them stayed in England, that's Eliot and Pound. And in England proper, we have such important names, W.B. Yeats, who was instrumental in getting Nobel Prize for Rabindranath Tagore in 1913. Then you have W.H. Adan, who migrated to America, very strange. Stephen Spender, and that confessional poet Ted Hughes. So these are very important modernist poets in England and America, and they changed the entire poetic scene of the English language programs. Secondly, with equal importance, we come across change in the writing styles of modern fiction, English fiction. Such a galaxy of writers, beginning with D.H. Lawrence, Joseph Conrad, Virginia Woolf, Henry James, and then E.M. Forster, who was in India for some years, and James Joyce, of course, Virginia Woolf. These great modernist novelists changed the scenario of writing modernist novel. Some of the important changes are using of fragmented narratives, stream of consciousness narrative technique, very important in their novels. In poetry, old prosody was discarded. Chandasu, old prosody was discarded, and in its place they used free verse. So, thus we find great changes in these two genres of literature. In addition to these qualities, we notice abstraction. Modern literature, it is not modern, it is modernist literature. Modernist literature has the quality of abstraction. Many people cannot understand it. They call it all obscure, and there is it is characterized as avant-garde. Avant-garde means a very advanced kind of art forms, avant-garde. And there is a complaint that this modernist business is a masculine affair. Okay, not many women participated except Virginia Woolf, but Woolf was a great name. Well, then there is a symbolist movement. This symbolist movement influenced modernist poetry. Yeats, Eliot, Ibsen, Flaubert, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Conrad, James, Lawrence, all these modernist writers, poets, novelists, other writers, artists, they were influenced by symbolism, French symbolism, which was the reason because of Poe, American Edgar Allan Poe. It said modernist poetry followed an iconoclastic agenda, overthrowing conventional forms and moving towards fragmentation. This is a very proper characterization of modernist poetry. there was fragmentation, free verse, complex allusion, and patterning and personal discourse, often purposefully obscure. This is modern poetry. These effects are most evident in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, W. Yeats in British poetry. There is a poem called, Ezra Pound's poem called In a Station of a Metro. You read it 2 times, 10 times, but it's difficult to understand it. It is written in the fashion of imagism or verticism. And Eliot's epic poem, The Wasteland, captures the largest audience of any single modernist poem. In the 1930s poets W. H. Auden, C. D. Lewis, Stephen Spender, Louis Macnish in England, and H. D. and William Carlos Williams in America, they followed suit. There is another critical theory which we shall fruitfully study in the study of Eliot as a critic, that is formalism. This formalism at the outset speaks of form. We all talk of subject matter as very important. Formalists say form is as important as subject matter. You prepare a food, the way you prepare food is as important as the things you put into that food. Form is very important. We talk of discipline, we talk of commitment, isn't it? The way is also very important. That is a form, formalism or method. So, formalism as a critical theory was born in the 1915s, Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. A great man I need to mention, his name is Roman Jakobson. One more, Victor Shklovsky. They inaugurated a new scientific approach to the study of literature that focused upon the linguistic devices and conventions. How you understand the greatness of a poem in Kannada? You see the theme and you then see how that theme is put into a form. What kind of language, what kind of figures of speech are used, comparison, contrast, descriptions. You read it. Does it affect you? Do you forget the whole world while reading the great poem? These are the parameters. So, from meter to plot structure by which literature distinguishes itself from ordinary use of language. This demands an objective account of literature. Romantic writers wrote subjective literature. There, the writer or poet's personality was much seen. Modernist poets, formalist poets avoid that subjective approach to the study of literature, to the creation of literature. When you write a poem, you must write like a universal man. When we read your poem, we shouldn't find your biography there. So, your biography, your personal experience, your understanding or whatever observations must be put in objects and to be related to other objects. That is objective correlativity by Eliot. So, after reading the poem, people should say that it is your poem, it is about you. No, people should say that it can be anybody's poem, about anybody's experience. That is objective correlativity. Okay, this Russian formalism is important in so far. We talk of defamiliarization. You know, in this essay, Mr. Eliot is telling that your experience should be objectified. They should appear like, sound like anybody's experience. That is defamiliarization. They shouldn't be familiar like your poetry, your experience. No, they should be defamiliarized. They must sound like, read like anybody's experience. That is objective, that is defamiliarization effect. In other words, he uses a term called impersonality theory of art. Impersonality theory of art. Personality, impersonality. Means it is not subjective like what romantic poets wrote. This modern poetry is objective poetry. It can be anybody's poetry. It may be abstract, it may be obscure, you may not understand, but suggestion is there. You need not understand line by line like school children. The poem, its parts, its imagery suggests you something. So, you will be happy. That is formalist observation, that is T.S. Eliot, that is how T.S. Eliot uses formalism and brings out these concepts like defamiliarization or impersonality theory in art. Mr. Eliot's essay Tradition and the Individual Talent appeared in a book form in 1920. The essay begins with a remarkable line. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition. The poise and authority of Eliot's critical voice made tradition, the concept or word tradition, a key topic for poets, critics, intellectuals and teachers of literature. His concept of tradition encouraged two important critics of the times to write separate books on tradition. The first was F.R. Lewis's book Revolution, Tradition and Development in English Poetry, 1936, and Cleon Brooks' book, equally a very important book, Modern Poetry and the Traditions, 1939. Eliot thinks people use the term tradition for criticizing rather than for the appreciation of the work of art. Often people use the word tradition. What for? To criticize other writers. For example, they say Mr. XYZ is traditional. XYZ's writings are very traditional. What does it mean? Means it has become derogatory. His books are traditional means his books are only about the past and nothing new in it. So you need not read it. He writes, the word tradition is not likely to appear in our appreciation of living or dead writers. Like an individual, every nation or race has its own bent of mind or taste. We talk of the habits of the French people. We talk of the habits of Marathi people, Bengali people are the Sikhs in India. We tell that the French are more critical than the English people. Criticism is as essential as our breathing. Means the point is that we talk of criticism, we talk of criticality of a poem or a novel. We criticize a novel in good sense, in positive sense. We say that the so and so poem is traditional. We talk of a drama as a Sanskrit drama, for example, as classical, and we talk of a biography as a wholly American in taste. So this is criticism. And you see the past writers, their language, style, ideology assert in these new writers. Sometimes we say that Mr. So and Mr. John is like hardy in his language and style. We compare a man in this fashion using the past writers. Thus, tradition is both something to which the poet must be faithful and something that he actively makes novelty. He actively makes that part of tradition. Novelty emerges out of being steeped in tradition. There are also new writers, isn't it? There are young writers, isn't it? There are women writers, isn't it? Yet, if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, then Eliot says this tradition should positively be discouraged. If you always think that tradition is nothing but handing down to the future generations, then that tradition is not useful any longer. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition again and again. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It is a more important aspect. It cannot be inherited. Eliot says you can't have the great art knowledge of your father. How do you get that great knowledge which your father had? Can you inherit it like you inherit his properties? No. You have to learn it with labor. If you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It cannot be inherited. It involves acquisition of tradition from your father, great art from your father, great art from your teacher, others. How do you get it? How you inherited it? You get it with hard work, learning. And this in the first place is the historical sense. Historical sense which you may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a great poet after 25th year. And the historical sense involves an understanding not only of the pastness of the past but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer and within it the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. When you write a great poem or want to write a great poem, you must know what is European traditions, English traditions at least. What is the English traditions, writing poetry traditions in England of your country? You must have Shakespeare, Chaucer, Spenser, Dryden, Pope, the great romantics, the great Victorians in your mind when you write a poem. This historical sense which is a sense of timeless as well as of the temporal and of the timeless and of the temporal together is what makes a writer traditional. You should know what is timeless, what is a temporal of great traditions in English, in England, then write it. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his own contemporaneity. Eliot tells, no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. He doesn't have his complete meaning alone. A man cannot live alone. Likewise, art doesn't live alone. It only lives in the company of his forebears, contemporary artists and future artists. His significance, his appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison. Very important. You write a great poem, you compare, for example, in Kannada, isn't it, boy? Well, then you compare your great poem with great Dharwad poets, for example, Bendre, for example, Chandraveer Kadvi. You compare them with South Karnataka poets, past poets. Then only you will come to know where you stand. This is comparison and contrast. I mean this as a principle aesthetics. It's a principle of aesthetics, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments, here is an analogy, an example. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves. You find the notable historical buildings, how they stand. Many buildings were constructed in a different ages by different political dynasties. And now you see all the buildings, they all look alike in a good synthesis, in harmony, because of this synthesization of the past with the present. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered, and so the relations. So the past guides the present, and the present alters, changes, makes changes in the past. This is how the past and the present go together. So it alters the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward whole things. This is called a kind of conformity to the past, to the tradition. So the tradition is good to much extent. Any present writer is to be judged by the standards of the past. Its judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. We cannot say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in is a test of its value. Eliot continues his arguments. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, He can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or the two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. This past is acquired not like property, a building or bank account or deposits. This past you must acquire by tedious hard work with dedication. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves and the materials of art are not always the same. You look at sculpture, you look at painting. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, the materials of art have changed. And here is a point: the art never, art never improves. Look at the fashion designs of cloths; they don't change much, but the materials change. Old art forms come back. New art forms are shaped out from imitation, from Bollywood, from cinema, from abroad. Things go on. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past. If you are writing poetry or painting a picture, sculpting an image of a great man, and if you are aware of the past, that is nothing but you are aware of the present. If you are aware of the present, that is as good as you are aware of the past and the traditions. So, in a way and to extent which the past awareness of itself cannot show. Some can absorb knowledge and the more tardy must search for it. For example, William Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch's lives than many people today get this knowledge by sitting in the library in the British Museum for years. So, what is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. It is not one day's work. Rome was not built upon in 7 days. It is a lifelong sadhana, lifelong work. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. Understanding of the elders, traditions, good things of the past. How do you do it? By surrendering ourselves to the great people, by imitating the great traditions. Then only we will be part of the past, valuable past. So, we need to surrender to the elderly people, to the intellectuals in society, at home, and to great traditions. It is a continual surrender of oneself. He tells the progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. In the beginning, I reiterated the statement that he is talking about objective correlativity, he is talking about defamiliarization, or talking about impersonality theory of art, impersonal theory of art. Here the word is we surrender to the past, we surrender to the old traditions, and the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of a personality. In the poem, I am not going to write about myself, my family members, my love affairs, etc. I am only writing about my experience, which is as good as your experience, which is as good as the experience of a man 10 years later, 25 years earlier. Universal experience. Poetry deals with the universals. It is therefore more philosophical than history, as Aristotle said. So, this theory is called impersonality theory of art. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. If you write a poem about yourself, your love affairs, which people do not like, if you write a poem about common experience, then it attains the condition of science. All people will like it. So, only by going objective, only by going impersonal, or what he uses the word depersonalization, we reach the condition of science. If art subjects or fine arts cultivate this kind of a tendency in the process, arts will be as much valuable as the science subjects or social science subjects. Very important. I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely fluoridated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. You take a chamber, something like bulb, there is a platinum filament in the bulb or chamber. Suppose it is chamber means a kind of bulb. There is a platinum filament in the chamber. Yes, you put two gases there. One is called oxygen, the other is called sulfur dioxide. It's a kind of analogy. What happens? I will tell you. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. This analogy of a bulb or chamber with a platinum filament and two gases, oxygen and sulfur dioxide, explains this analogy. I have tried to point out the importance of relation of the poem to other poems by other authors and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author. Here, the author or the poet surrenders his personality. You read his poem, we come to know less and less about the poet and more about his experience. What is his experience? His experience is others' experience also. Means community experience, society experience, universal experience. That is objective, correlative or impersonal theory of poetry. And here, what is a poet? What is his mind? It is a finely perfected medium. The poet's mind is a finely perfected medium. It is not some personal poet or somebody like Bendre or Kanvi. It is a universal poet's mind. It is a more finely perfected medium. He refers to a word called catalysm. The poet's mind is like a catalyst. He involves in the preparation of the poem, but he is not there seen in the experience of the poem, but he should be there. So, he is a catalyst. Well, see, the analogy was that of the catalyst. When the two gases previously mentioned are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. So, these two gases, oxygen and sulfur dioxide, if they are mixed in the chamber where there is a filament, platinum filament, what happens? There will be a reaction between oxygen and sulfur dioxide. The result is they create sulfurous acid. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. These two gases, you put these two gases and it becomes a sulfurous acid. The third material, see the point, this new material will be produced only if the platinum filament is there in the chamber, otherwise it does not become a sulfurous acid. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum and the platinum itself is apparently unaffected, has remained inert, neutral and unchanged. So, these two gases become one third gas only if there is a platinum filament, and on the other hand the third gas does not affect platinum filament. So, poet's mind should be like platinum filament. If the poet is there, the poetry will be there, creation will be there, but that poetry does not have anything to do with the poet, his personal life. So, it may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. So, what are the materials of the poet? The poet's materials are his feelings, his emotions, his ideas, his ideology, that he is a Marxist, that he is a Dalit writer, that it is a woman poet, woman's feelings. But finally, the end product will be something universal. The poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, ideas, phrases, images that remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound as this one, like sulfurous acid. Mr. Eliot quotes a famous folklore story called Paolo and Francesca. It is like our Sangyabala drama in Kannada. It has a universal experience. Anybody can be a Sangya, anybody can be a Bala, two friends. So the poet has not a personality. In the creation of a poem, the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions, experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. So, in this personality, in that poetic mind, in that poetic medium, impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. New ideas, new sequences of feelings, new kind of combinations appear in that great poem, in that great painting, in that great sculpture, whatever, fine arts. So, impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the poem, in the man, the personality. Mr. Eliot's famous poetic statement is as follows: the business of the poet is not to find new emotions. No, we don't need new emotions. Whatever new emotions, feelings, ideas you have, it's good, but you put them in a new manner, new way. But to use the ordinary ones and in working them up into poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all, and emotions which he has never expressed will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. Consequently, we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquility. A great romantic poet, you have heard his name, William Wordsworth, with his friend Coleridge, both were critics also, started a great romantic poem, a great movement called Romanticism in English literature from 1798. English Romanticism stayed up to 1830 and it affected the entire Europe and America. In America, Romantic age started in 1820, a little belatedly. These romantic poets, particularly Wordsworth, he defined poetry. He was a great poet. You can read his famous poems like We Are Seven, Daffodils, Lucy poems. He defined poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. That's his famous definition of poem. Poem is, what is a poem? It is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. You note down this famous statement or definition: spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected when you are alone, solitude. That's a romantic definition. Mr. Eliot reacts against romanticism. He is a modernist poet. Modernism is a great reaction to the old traditions, past traditions, romanticism or even Victorianism. So Eliot says poetry is not, it's not an overflow of powerful feelings, he tells. It's not an expression of emotions, it is an escape from emotions. So, you need to understand this contrast. It is not emotion recollected in tranquility, it is not an expression of emotions, an expression of personality, but it is an escape from emotions, an escape from personality, he tells. And he tells that you can't dream with ganja, eating, etc., and write a poem. No. Poetry is not something like a word of emotions. It is a conscious creation. It is a deliberate creation. Any Tom, Dick and Harry cannot write poems. You must be a learned man. You must have very fine feelings, emotions, familiar with music and dance and other arts. And if you like to write something about a rainbow in Agumbe, something like the continuous rains in Chirapunji, then you can write a poem deliberately, consciously. So poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, it is an escape from personality. In other words, Mr. Eliot thinks the emotion of art is impersonal. It is not personal. Poetry, art cannot be your private property one day. It will be a community's property, a society's expression. For Eliot, every great poem exists within the tradition. Another important thing is that it is part of the tradition. Bendre has written a great poem, yes, Ni Baro Sadhana Kerige, for example, and it is part of the tradition, Kannada poetry tradition. For example, Ayur Singh has written some famous lines. Kesarinditu Kumbarage ni tuli tuli, tulive neenu nannanu ಎಷ್ಟು ದಿನ, ಎನ್ನಡಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಿನ್ನನ್ನು ತುಳಿಯಲು ಬರುವುದು ಒಂದು ದಿನ. This stanza is not something about poet Ayur Singh's family affairs. It is Kannada, part of great Kannada traditions about the tussle, the conflict between the mud and that of potter. Kesarinditu Kumbar, Kesaru and Kumbar, potter and the mud are quarreling. Very interesting analogy. So, dear students, you need to understand and recall Bendre's famous dictum, Hade Beru, Hosa Chiguru. Hade Beru means a tradition, Hosa Chiguru means your creation. Every year, every decade, every generation, you have come across hundreds of Kannada poets, but how many of them remain eternal after 500 years? Only hardly a few, because of this difficulty of writing poetry. So, Mr. Eliot recalls tradition as a living whole. Tradition means not something which you don't want. It is not simply the past. What is tradition? It is whatever you are remembering today, whatever you are using today in the present tense, in the present day, in your day-to-day life. We are using these books even today in the digital era. It is part of tradition. Today so many people, our readers, our students do not read books in hard copy. They only open the mobile set, screen and read e-books. But you know, these hard books also have their own advantage and it is part of tradition. So, Eliot calls tradition as a living whole. This tradition is something which is still living in your present. That is tradition. So, it is a living whole, an ideal order, and he uses the word mind of Europe, thereby idealizing its conflicts, contradictions and omissions. This is how we understand and value Mr. T.S. Eliot as a great modernist poet and critic, and here are some final assessment or reception history. Norton Anthology adds, Eliot was adept at formulating the nature and function of literary criticism, and new critics in hooked his critical practice as a great model. He described criticism as a disinterested exercise of intelligence, the elucidation of works of art and the correction of taste. It's correction of taste. Taste and correction of taste. Taste and judgment are very important. The common pursuit of true judgment. Comparison and analysis, he said, are the chief tools of the criticism. Comparison and analysis are very important. By the 1950s, Eliot was lamenting the rise of copiously detailed interpretation of text, which he called layman's quizzing. But perhaps more than anyone else, he had launched the new modernist poetry movement. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation are directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. This speaks of objective correlativity, defeminization theory, impersonality theory, objectivity theory. In such sentences, we can see the origins of new criticism with its abiding concern for the words on the page. New critics speak and teach in the school to students. You see the lines, poems on the page, not outside the text. All the technical devices of literature. For many critics in the 1930s, there was a reaction to T.S. Eliot. I tell it very briefly, as it is too important. T.S. Eliot was a white man. He was a European. He was a Christian. He was a traditionalist. He did not write anything about the black people, about the brown people of Asia and Africa. He didn't appreciate woman's genius. And as a Christian, he had a little disinterest about the Jews or Hebrews. And his this so-called new critical school at Yale, American South, it appreciated objective theories in teaching methodologies, and new writers, new critics, they termed them as narrow-minded. So this is how there is a kind of reaction against T.S. Eliot's theories of poetry, his critical models, and what else about his attitude towards the third world. He didn't appreciate the third world, So, but still Eliot is very important for all of us, and literary modernism is unimaginable without T.S. Eliot. So, and the best of his work has remained extraordinarily influential even today. Thank you.